Could you use a form of sentiment analysis to determine if something needs moderation? Like, this is violent talk and it needs moderation. This is calls for insurrection or violence. Is that possible?
Not exactly. Sentiment analysis in the current state of the art could be a useful tool or an aid in that process, but not an automated solution.
Welcome to the Deep Chat.
Can you give us a definition of what you see sentiment analysis as from your expertise in AI and machine learning, et cetera?
Sure. So it's the broad class of algorithms that look at text, or actually it can now be images and video and stuff too, but let's just focus on text. You give it an arbitrary amount of text, and it will give you back, in the simplest case, an indication of the sentiment, usually positive, negative, neutral. But depending on the algorithm or the implementation, could go into a lot of details, or could even tell you which words or which parts of the sentence were of each different sentiment. But broadly speaking, assign a label to text that tells you something about the emotion or feeling or expressiveness or whatever. Positive, negative, neutral is the most common.
So it goes down to positive, negative, neutral, not happy, aggressive, violent.
Well, that's possible too. Sentiment analysis isn't necessarily a special problem within natural language processing. Like, another natural language processing problem might be deciding if a sentence is coherent, if it totally makes sense or is just a grammatically correct jumble of words. So coherence testing and sentiment analysis, even though they seem very different, actually are using a lot of the same underlying technology. The old school way to do it was like linguistical approaches, where you look at the different words and the construction of the sentence and you kind of derive statistical stuff from it. The modern approach is to use something like BERT vectors, which is this embedding process. If you don't know what it is, just go look it up. BERT has been this amazing innovation in NLP, where it takes in arbitrary text and converts it into like a numeric representation that to your eyes and mine is meaningless, but if you use it in machine learning, it's very powerful. It kind of captures some of the underlying essence of it. And so all that stuff can be specially trained. If you want to come up with your own labels of happy, sad, incitement to violence, as long as you have enough example text, not even a huge amount, it used to require a lot. You can do things today with small samples, but you have to provide it some amount of training to customize it to your situation. And therein lies a problem, right? That training is biased and it's on historical data only.
So there's no public data sets for saying, hey, this is good training for violence. This is good training for happy.
Stuff like that probably exists, but these are evolving topics. People talk in codes, they reference news events and things like that. So the idea, even if you have a sentiment analysis thing that's updating in real time every hour based on the latest post to Reddit or something like that, it's still at the state of the art. Like, that would be an advanced engineering build out. If someone did it, it would still be just a tool today. It wouldn't, because ultimately this is the Turing test. You would have to have artificial general intelligence to completely do this task, because language is amongst the most complicated thing we do.
The differences in how people speak and short lingo or colloquialisms, etc.
Yeah. And context, especially, knowing the speaker tells you a lot about the words.
Maybe coming in halfway through the conversation, without context, you come into a conversation that's been going on for half an hour, you have nothing, you have no information. And it could be two people doing that. They just hop on, they're starting to chat, and they already talked for half an hour on the phone prior to that, right?
Sure.
So that makes it difficult. So the reason I bring this up was because Parlor, let's say Parlor was doing some machine learning to capture some of this, or some AI to capture things and flag them for moderation. My guess is they're not at all, right? Let's just say they're not.
They must have been doing it because it's too easy to do. So if they weren't doing any, that actually is negligent. Any company of a decent size, one data scientist can do this.
That's what I was going to ask, is how hard is it? Is it basically like an assumption that if you're doing public-facing stuff and you need to moderate, you would be doing this, period?
Setting up the algorithms and stuff, that's a small build out. I do stuff like that. My small team can set you up in a couple of weeks. The problem isn't installing algorithms and getting them working. It's having an operational process around this. So what do we do with these flags I'm going to produce? Because they're not perfect. There's going to be false positives. which maybe you need a human reviewer to look at, and false negative stuff I didn't catch. So how do you deal with each of those situations? And because if you just ban everything I flag, you're going to piss a lot of people off for good reason because you over-filtered. So do we now need to set up a human queue? And how do we hire those people? And how do we train them? There's all those sorts of operational issues to be sorted.
Yeah, that was my next question. That was exactly where I was leading is, false positives, and when does a human have to get in the loop? And can we give percentages as to how bad something is so that it can bubble to the top and get addressed quickly? And the reason I say that is because Parlor is a small company, or it started small, and then they suddenly were scaling rapidly, and they probably didn't have enough human operators to catch all of the bad stuff.
Yeah.
If they had, let's just say this, if they had no human operators, that was negligent. We can agree on that, right?
Yep.
You just can't run a social platform and have no human moderators being there controlling for that content.
You should also be collecting user feedback. Like there should be a way users can flag the content. And again, your human operator should be, because those flags could be used for censorship too. So you don't want to just accept them. But that stuff is a queue to review as well.
And so it sounds to me that there's a certain operations cost that maybe they just weren't scaling quickly enough to solve.
Yep.
And if they weren't doing it at all, like you said, if they weren't doing any of that, well, that's a problem. But let's just assume that they were. My next thing is that they probably just didn't scale quickly enough, and they couldn't get enough human operators in there. Because the solution, as you're saying, is there, and it's relatively inexpensive. The expensive part is the operation. Like, I can't imagine the army Facebook has dealing with that. How does anybody ever start a social platform if that's the case? You have to grow really slow so you can scale accordingly. And this is where back to that argument about banning Parlor is, did they make a good faith effort?
Hard to say.
Hard to say. We don't know. If they did make a good faith effort and it was just a problem of scaling, well, how does that get taken into consideration? Apple at one point said, look, if they do moderation, we'll let them back on. And that's fair. That's what I thought.
Well, don't ban. Who's the arbiter? Who gets to decide?
Well, exactly. And that goes back to our previous conversation. On the topic of sentiment analysis, I think that I understand it better, and I understand where it could be used. Is there any other areas where sentiment analysis is or used that you're aware of in a novel way or research?
A lot of people talk about its use in finance, but I certainly wouldn't invest in a hedge fund who said that was one of their major advantages. So I think it's one of those kind of utility tools out there, kind of like, I don't know, a spell checker. Certainly that's helped a lot of industries, maybe even some surprising ones, like there's, mail order catalogs that improved efficiency because they have low wage people typing stuff in or something. But no, I'm not aware of any specific industry breakthrough. It's just become one of those more fundamental tools.
Is there a company, and perhaps if there's not, maybe you should do it, a company that you can hire to say, hey, look, we want you to monitor anything about us on the internet and give us sentiment analysis on it so we can monitor our brand? Social
listening, yeah. There's a whole cottage industry of companies doing that kind of stuff. A lot of it's just, charts and nonsense. But if that's something you need to monitor and they provide you useful signals, then it's a good service.
Right, but it exists and it...
Oh, it more than exists. If you even type that in, you're just going to get spam for about 3 weeks at least. It's worse than the flowers after Valentine's Day.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there are so many companies trying to do that.
It's basically brand monitoring, right? In effect, you have a brand.
And they call it all types of stuff: brand protection, social management. They have a bunch of fancy names for this generalized kind of following you online stuff.
Well, interesting. Well, that's cool. I figured that must exist. Usually anytime I think of an idea, I assume that it exists, especially in coding. When I think, well, I need to do this in my code. It's probably already exists and there's a library out there for it.
Yeah.
Unless it's something really novel.
Most likely.
There's another area for sentiment analysis, and I'm sure in the intelligence community they're experimenting with it. But as you said, it's very difficult to accurately say something specific. It's more generalizations about the general sentiment, not the specific sentiment.
If it, as one of the tools in your tool chain, can help you reduce your queue of 10,000 messages to 100 messages that can then be processed, then it's a powerful tool.